And now, let us give a warm and enthusiastic welcome, which is a good reaction. To Betty Reid Soskin. And I will mention that many of us have read her book, Sign My Name to Freedom, but if you haven't, we have a very limited number of copies that'll be available after the service. But we are so grateful, and with so much gratitude, we are so glad you are here today.
Thank you so much. You know, I've been sitting here wondering what in the world I was going to say. Because I've been, I think, maybe for the past decade, having outlived my sense of future, because I'm 97. And because of that, my models for how you lived this last decade, obviously my final decade, they don't exist anymore. I've outlived most of my peers. And I'm not sure that I'm not involved in one grand improvisation. I make it up as I go along every day, but I not only do that, but now I'm making up every hour because I never know when it's going to end. But what dawned on me, sitting here watching and listening to this incredible service, was the fact that I am dealing now with absurdity as a guiding principle. Because that is probably what characterizes my life, not only outside, but within this church. But it dawned on me as I came in this morning and you were singing the first song, the gathering song, and I began to hear people clapping. And what dawned on me was a service, not even a service, but sitting in the chapel at Asilomar, at a Stebbins Institute. Way back, we gathered to watch a rehearsal of people who were going to be performing later in the evening. And they were gathered around a piano, and someone was leading them in the singing of the blues of Frankie and Johnny. And he was asking them to clap, and I started to clap as they were singing Frankie and Johnny were lovers. And suddenly they stopped cold. And the director said, if we can't clap in time, please hold your silence. And it was then that I realized that I was the only black person in the room and that I was clapping on 2 and 4. And everybody else was clapping on 1 and 3. And that's maybe when the principle dawned on me that the greatest difference between the races was that you clap on 1 and 3 and we clap on 2 and 4. And to show how much progress is going on in this church, you guys are clapping on 2 and 4. How much progress that represents to people like me. And that may be only the first rule of absurdity. It's also true that this is where I grew up as a young young mother, when I was in a hostile community, where our family was the only family in the Diablo Valley, beside the Watkins families, who were of color, where we were living with death threats, and nobody knew it. That hostile climate I was rescued from by David Borton, who followed me to a meeting at Gregory Gardens when I had determined, after living in this situation for about 3 years, that I was going to save the couple who'd moved into Gregory Gardens of color, because I had lived through that, and my neighbors had lived through it, and they were going to get over it, and I was going to attend their Improvement Association meeting and tell them that it was all going to be over with, that they just took their time. And David, a member of this fellowship at that time, read a letter that I'd written to the editor of the local newspaper, defending that young couple's right to live in Gregory Gardens. And he contacted me. And I told him I was going to go to that meeting, which was, I think, going to be held the next night, out at Gregory Gardens. And he said that you can't do that, Betty, because they're going to hurt you. And I said, no, they're not, because people don't say those nasty things if you're sitting there. They only say them behind your back. Only I didn't realize that my racial ambiguity would not afford me that disguise. And I went to that meeting. David was in the audience, so I didn't know who he was at the time. Sat in the meeting, waiting for my turn to speak. Only no one recognized me as a woman of color. And they went on with their meeting, and I heard the awful things for the very first time in my life. When someone got up and said, if we can't get them out any other way, we can use the health department on the basis of the filthy diseases they bring into the community. And at that point, I could no longer stand it, and I got up and walked up the aisle and to the front of the room, and I said, I cannot sit here any longer eavesdropping. You need to know I'm here, and I'm one of the undesirables, unquote, that you're speaking about. And I went on with my spiel and got about 10 minutes in, trying to defend that couple's right to be there, and panicked about 10 minutes in. Got up and ran out of the auditorium. David followed me out to the car in the dark. He said, I am David Borton. I'm with the Unitarian Universalist, well, at that point, Unitarian movement. And he said, there are others here, and we want you to know that we're with you. That was my introduction to this fellowship. I became a member shortly thereafter of the families who were gathering here, forming the fellowship that began this church. One of the reasons I did that was because I was at that point a former Catholic, a recovering Catholic. And the only reason I was attending church was because I found that that was the only place in the Diablo Valley where I could be anonymous. I could sit in the congregation and no one would pay attention to me because they were busy with their rituals. I attended my first meetings here with the Unitarians, and that grew to be all the chairs. I got to be the Sunday school superintendent after 6 months because nobody would pick up that. When the Black Caucus arrived, we'd grown to have a minister by that time, Aaron Gilmartin, who turned out to be the light of my life. Gil came back from New York after experiencing the moving out of the black members of the Unitarians nationwide into the Black Caucus. He came back and he said, Betty, this is something you have to experience. And I said, no, we've been working on integration now for many years. I mean, how absurd is that? I'm going to go back and be a nationalist now? And he said, no, there's something happening here in the Unitarian denomination, and you have to know about that. Now, at that point, I'm not sure whether the McGregors were members of the church yet. I don't know when the next African Americans came in. But at that point, funded by this church membership, I was sent back to participate in the Black Power Conference. I was probably the only member of the Black Caucus who arrived at the Hilton Hotel with a white chauffeur carrying my bags. Talk about absurdities. It was an experience that I would experience for 3 years. Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. Trying to be Black enough for the Black community and the Black Revolution, while not quite being white enough for the suburbs in which I had lived. Talk about absurdities. It was a life-changing experience for me. Had I not had this congregation to grow through that with me, had I not had a place that was willing to help to bear the cost of my growth, I would not be where I am right now. That would have been impossible. The fact that your faces are now different, that the diversity that we may have been striving for hasn't yet been achieved quite, that the absurdity has changed character at this point. It's as much economic as it is racial. It's that I have stopped expecting to be able to correct democracy, recognizing that it was never a fixed thing and that it will never be fixed and that it's a process that every generation has to recreate in its time or it will die. Talk about absurdities. I didn't learn that by myself. I learned that in this church under the guidance of Aaron Gilmartin. I learned it at Star King as a board member of the Star King board under Bob Kimball and Rebecca Parker. I learned to be whole enough to have assumed finally, after a lifetime of believing firmly that their entitlements that came with me at birth, that they were unfulfilled promises that had never been kept by my democracy, that there was unfinished work that had to be done, and not realizing until only a few months ago when I was speaking in upstate New York to the students and faculty at SUNY in Bloom, New York, and seeing the despair in that age group, seeing the terror in what they're facing, and realizing that in that time that I had to be there, I was bringing forth all the things that I had learned here over those years. And what I had learned most importantly was that I had somehow drifted over a barrier that I didn't know was there. And that barrier was that I had been expecting fulfillment. And I had drifted over into being a fulfiller, and that being a fulfiller was inconsistent with victimization. And that had come with my Unitarian training. That I couldn't hold to that victim place and be a fulfiller, but that at SUNY Broome, when we got through with the talk, and those kids came up to me to hug, I don't know what had happened in that room, except that those hugs were real and they were deep and they were deeply felt. And I knew that I had fulfilled something in them that I didn't even know I had within myself. It's an amazing, amazing thing, this Unitarianism. You can't always name it, you can't always talk about what it is, except that I know that over those years, in this congregation, though I haven't been here for over 20 years, that somewhere in that place, I absorbed enough to not only take me through to where I am now, and that is an exalted place that I could never have realized. I didn't know that I could become a historian simply by outliving all the people whose memories don't agree with mine. I thought it took 12 years at least of graduate school. But who argues with a dinosaur? I mean, come on, when I say goes. But the absurdities, the fact that my work now grew out of the fact that after 20 years in this valley, as an underprivileged person in this valley, after 20 years, more than 20 years, of friendships with privileged people, there's a rubbing off process. And I returned 15 years ago to the city of Richmond, this time as a field representative for a member of the California State Assembly. How does that happen? I didn't even graduate. I mean, I didn't even go to college. But I had two doctorates. I mean, I have had 2 honorary doctorates. And I'm a graduate of Castlemont High School in Oakland. But not only that, I became a park ranger at 85. How absurd is that? And the reason I became that park ranger was not only that Unitarian background, where anything was possible, but the fact that I was sitting in a room at the dawning of a new national park, looking, along with the planners from the Department of Interior and the National Park Service, who had come to Richmond, California, because Richmond was the only place suitable in the country for the telling, the interpreting of the home front history. Because there were more still standing structures there than any other place in the country through which to interpret that history. But because I'm the only African American in the room, and what does that hark back to? I am able to watch the PowerPoint and see all of the scattered sites that were going to interpret this history and realize they were all sites of racial segregation. And that I was the only one in the room who knew that, because I was the only person of color in the room to whom that would have made a difference. Talk about absurdities. It was an amazing, amazing experience, because my fingerprints are all over that park now, because all those sites have been reinstated in truth as they were lived by the people who lived them. That's amazing. Talk about absurdities. Shipyard 3, which is a part of the park where the Red Oak Victory is birthed. The Red Oak Victory being one of the 747 ships built by Henry Kaiser. One of the 747 ships built in 3 years and 8 months to help to turn the course of the war around. But there are photographs of thousands of people at Shipyard 3 who are crossing those acres toward those ships to do their working on 3 shifts a day around the clock, building those ships to fight the war. By so doing, they helped to turn the course of the war around by outproducing the enemy. But on those same acres now are acres and acres of brand new cars that are being brought in, mostly through the canal, because those container ships are too big to even come in other place. But there are acres and acres, and those same acres that had thousands and thousands of workers going in and out to build the ships of war. Now, that same operation is run by a bank of golf carts and about 24 men who are driving those ships to and the unloading or to and from those ships, the mats and lines. And against a war in which we lost 54.8 million people worldwide, 54.8 million worldwide, and 37,600 on the home front accidents. Against that kind of life, that same acreage is now carrying Honda cars from Japan. Talk about absurdities. The Red Oak Victory was built in a war against Japan. And all of this happened within my lifetime. All of it. And most of those lives, those life changes, occurred right here. Most of the fact that the anger, the rage that was allowed by me in a congregation that was willing to accept the cost of helping me to grow, because of that, I built enough spine so that I am not only free to live a life of change, but to have a sense of participating in that change, to know that I'm making a difference. That I will be this afternoon when I leave here, picked up by a limousine in Richmond that will take me to the airport, to tomorrow participate in a workshop called Unreasonable Conversations with General Stanley McChrystal, with John Legend, the singer, with Stacey Abrams, the former mayor, with David Brooks of the New York Times, and me. Talk about absurd. And it's no more absurd than the fact that I was able to see the change in this church this morning by the fact that most of you were clapping on 2 and 4. Thank you very much for including me.